Well, it is now 12 o'clock Pacific time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to go ahead and start. So again, officially, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone from around the world. Welcome to our first monthly educational event series and fireside chat here with Dr. Carl Marci. I'm super thrilled to have you all here today, again, joining from various parts of the world. My name is Sophie Bowles. I'm a positive media psychologist and the research director at the Digital Wellness Institute. I'm also an associate professor at Chapman University, which is located in Orange, California. So that's where I am calling in from. And I'll be the host for our first fireside chat here today. I'm so excited to have and to welcome Dr. Carl Marci here to kick us off in our free monthly educational event series. And he will be talking about his recent book release, Rewired, Protecting Your Brain in the Digital Age. A little bit about Dr. Marci. He is a physician, a neuroscientist, an author, and entrepreneur. He's currently a chief psychiatrist and managing director of mental health and neuroscience at Home1, which is a venture-backed health technology real-world data company. He's also a part-time assistant professor at psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. Dr. Marci has worked at multiple early-stage health technology and mental health delivery companies in the past, and he has extensive training in health research, the use of biological measures, and the neuroscience of emotion through 2 National Institutes of Health fellowships that he has worked for as well. He holds 7 US patents, has published numerous articles in peer-reviewed science journals, and is a leader in the field of social and consumer neuroscience and digital health. Today, he's chatting with us about his new book, again, Rewired, Protecting Your Brain in the Digital Age, which explores how excessive smartphone and social media usage is rewiring our brains, leading to a disconnect from meaningful relationships. The book provides scientifically backed solutions for restoring a healthy balance between technology and human connection in an increasingly digital world. We will give Dr. Marci the floor to provide us with an introduction into his book and then chat about his research for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then leave the last part of this webinar for questions from you. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we'll try our best, and you're welcome to put the questions into the chat as they come up throughout our discussion. So without further ado, Dr. Carl Marci, if you want to start us off and sharing a little bit about your book and your amazing work.
Oh, thanks for the introduction, Sophie, and for the invitation. So always happy to talk about this topic. It all started in around 2011. I tell this story in the introduction. I was working in New York with a company I had co-founded called Interscope Research, and we were a pioneer in a space called consumer neuroscience, which is a very niche area of marketing and media research, but we had very big clients, and one of them was the Time Warner company at the time, prior to Discovery purchasing them, and they had a lot of questions that our technology maybe could help them answer. And one of the questions was the impact of 2 screens, watching television while you're on your phone or on your iPad or your computer. And particularly, what would that impact be on advertising, which is their revenue source? So we set up a study in their shiny new media lab in the Columbus Circle in downtown Manhattan. And we recruited, this is 2011. So I remember the iPhone came out in 2007. So we're about 4 years into it. And we recruited young women, 18 to 20 years old, heavy users of social media, which at the time was, a limited set of applications, to bring their phones, and they were going to get paid $150 to watch TV for an hour while we monitor their eyes and some of their physiologic measures. And we had 2 conditions. One was watch like you would at home with your phone. The other is, oh, if you don't mind, we're going to take your phone and you're going to watch without it for an hour. Now, in hindsight, this is what we now call a deprivation study, which gives you some indication of how the world has changed. We just thought of it as a randomized study with and without your phone. And as I was watching, we had closed circuit television, and I was watching the first participant, young woman in the deprived group. She did not have her phone. She was sitting in her couch and she was fidgeting in this very peculiar way. And I was watching her, I was like, well, that's very odd behavior for one of our studies. Normally people at best are bored. And she kept doing that, and I realized, I don't think this young woman's going to make it through this hour. And she did. She got up about 10 minutes into it, grabbed her phone, ran out of the lab. And I was like, well, that was strange. Next one comes in, same thing. Next one comes in, same things. We lost a third of the participants in that group. And I went out to ask, is there any strange behaviors beforehand? Nope. Everybody seemed fine. Did they ask any questions on the way out? Did they ask for the money? Nope. They just grabbed their phone and left. And all I could think, and by the way, in the other condition, and these were randomized folks, no problems. Everybody stayed the whole time. And I began to think about some videos and movies I saw in college by B.F. Skinner, who, those of you who are old enough to remember behavioral psychology. So B.F. Skinner, believed that the brain was a black box. All you really needed to understand were the behaviors, the inputs and the outputs. And he famously put rodents into a box and gave them a lever press so they could choose sugar water, or they could choose water infused with cocaine. Of course, the mice would get hooked on the cocaine, and then he would take the cocaine away and the mice would squirm. And this was the first real documentation of what we now call physical manifestations of withdrawal. And I'm watching 19, 20-year-old young women, perfectly healthy, being paid to watch TV, have signs of withdrawal. And I just started to wonder, as a psychiatrist, whether we were seeing the early form of addiction. And that sort of sent me off on this, almost 10-year journey of writing this book, and now working with you all to try to promote it. So that's the background.
Thank you. Yes, that's amazing. I know in your book, what I love is you actually get to this rewired point where the behavioral things is one thing, but it actually impacts our brain. There's actually a way in which our brains are changed, which is just super wild to me, because those experiments, yes, with Skinner and the rodents, and we can kind of relate to, and yes, our behaviors change, and it makes sense that obviously when our behaviors change, there's something going on in the brain. But when we actually really dive deeper into it, then it leaves a trace, and it leaves a trace that doesn't just go away once we take a phone or a TV away. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then also, you talk about kind of these generally 5 themes within your book, which I thought was a really great way to structure really the discussion of social media on the brain. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, let's start with some very, very basic brain science, right? So human brain, between 60 and 80 billion neurons, each one making between 10 and 20,000 connections. It's thought to be one of the most complex entities in the known universe. And what's really cool is we all have one. And I make very few guarantees in life, but I guarantee the brain that you and your audience brought to the beginning of this webcast and the brain at the end will be different. Why? Because as we're discussing here, we will be shifting our attention between each other and our own thoughts. Your audience will be shifting their attention between what we're discussing and their world, their smartphone going off, emails in the background, and whatever other distractions are in their life. But we'll get some of their attention, and some of the information they're paying attention to will get tagged by the emotion centers for relevance, which is part of what the emotion centers do. And then some of that information will lay down a memory trace. And for some of your audience members, I hope that may influence their behavior at some point in the future. And what I just described for you is a neuroscience definition of engagement: attention to something that emotionally impacts you, leaves a memory trace, and then changes your behavior in the future. And if you think about that definition, it's how we really engage with the world around us, whether it's with friends or loved ones, with work, with media, with our environment. And that is something that starts with attention. And so when we're in a world where our focus and attention is hard to maintain, it's hard to engage with things. So that's sort of problem number 1. Problem number 2 is the brain is very complex. And as I do in the book, I think one of the benefits of taking a neuroscience lens to this problem is the ability to think developmentally. What do I mean by that? Well, the brain at birth is very different than a brain at 1 year old and 3 years old, 5, 10 to 12, teenage. We all know that's a unique time. Young adult, middle-aged, older adult. All these brain states we now understand at a pretty sophisticated level after 30 plus years of interrogating the brain with modern tools. So what we know is that at birth, the human brain is only partially developed, at best about 10%. So 90% of brain development occurs outside of the womb. And society says you have to be on the order of about 18 years before you can go off on your own. That's a really long time. So we should not be surprised that we are endowed with a network of neurons that allows us to form strong social bonds, right? Because if you think about it, anybody with young children or anybody who's been around young children knows that they're very fragile, particularly toddlers. You got to watch them every second of the day because they can get into trouble. Why? Because their prefrontal cortex is very, very small. And they really have very poor judgment, and they're just trying to navigate the world for the first time. Well, when we were kids, at least I say when I was kids, the average age of regular or sort of consistent media exposure was about 4 years old. Now kids are exposed at 4 months, and the average age of continuous exposure is around 9 months. And when you think about that developmentally, we know that children prior to the age of around 3, their ability to take information from a 2-dimensional screen and translate it into their 3-dimensional reality is incredibly limited. In fact, it's almost non-existent. So every second, every minute, every hour, a child under the age of 3 is in front of a screen, and it's happening more and more around the world as busy parents and others expose their children to media at an earlier and early age. Every hour per day increases the probability of ADHD at age 7 by about 10%. And that's an extraordinary number. So at that age, the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, recommends no screen time, 0, with one exception: video telephony with a loved one, for small periods. And that's actually, if you think about it, a very different proposition, talking to grandma, grandpa, or mom or dad or caregiver who's, you already have an attachment to, and they're interacting with you. And then we kind of march through time. You get to 3 to 5 years old, and it's all about reading. And how do we understand a brain learning to read? Well, we just started learning to read, or reading as a species, in the last 5,000 years. We've certainly been, around longer than that. We were hanging out with Neanderthals 50,000 years ago, and we probably have had, several 100,000 years of evolution prior to that, where we weren't reading at all. So we do not have networks of neurons that are dedicated to reading like we do forming attachments. So we have to recruit different centers of the brain in order to do this amazing skill called reading. Well, that requires intentional practice and a lot of support and a lot of teaching. So at the 3 to 5 year old age, screens are competing with our ability to read the written word. So there's a whole different set of recommendations that come there. And then we march through time. You get into the school age years, and then voila, the teenage brain. And we could talk about what's happening in the teenage brain. But at every stage, we have to think about where the brain is at in order to make recommendations about technologies that are this sophisticated, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah. And if you don't mind, actually talk a little bit about the difference between the traditional TV with then now the interactive iPad, which is obviously the day and age we live in now, where it's not only I plant my kid in front of a big screen television, which is also there, but there's also, I'm going to a restaurant, here's your iPad, and they obviously already figure out, right? There's funny memes on social media where you have this 9-month-old kid and is trying to grab something out of a book because they're already so used to touching it and grabbing things on the iPad. So how does that, right? What's the difference there in terms of that impact on the brain?
Yeah, I have this video of my daughter when she was 9 months old playing with my iPad and touching and smiling. And I was like, oh, she's so smart. And then, after doing research for this book, I realized, no, she's not smart. Steve Jobs is smart to make a technology that a 9-month-old can actually interact with. And that's our challenge, right? These things are so intuitive, a baby can handle them. But you're right to raise the point that not all content is the same, right? And so the difference between, particularly at young ages, what I refer to as long form, professionally produced educational content that is not the most concise phrase in the world, but long form, it's longer than 3 minutes. Typically, it's a half hour, an hour. Professionally produced means a group of people who are being very intentional and thoughtful are making the content, and they do that for a living as opposed to user-generated content. Educational, that means it is intended to actually teach something, content, and it tends to have a beginning, middle, and end without a ton of interruptions. That is a very different proposition than a 20-second TikTok video or a 3-minute unboxing video on YouTube. Right, I tell the story in the book of Ryan, who made $30 million making videos. His mom would record him opening a box. I mean, who knew that young kids, including my own, would be so enthralled by the dopamine surge of the unveiling of some toy in a box, right? I mean, but this is what these algorithms are so, that why they're so powerful, right? They don't discriminate between what's appropriate, what's not, what's educational, what's not. They just find what's popular and what people engage with at every age. And by the way, even YouTube's own requirement are that you have to be over 13 years of age to be on their device, even though there's plenty of content for young people. So the way I talk about in the book is that the problem with a small screen is it's very hard to monitor from a parental perspective. You can't see it, number one. Number two, most of the apps are geared towards snackable, short, user-generated, mostly titillating, less educating type of content. So you end up, number one, not giving them the best content in the world for their brain. And then number two, because of the autoplay and other features, it's designed to keep all of us engaged, right? I mean, keep in mind that there are companies worth billions and billions of dollars with many people using the same neuroscience I described in my book to sort of educate people how they have to be careful about media to get you hooked on media, right? That's their business proposition, right? And let's just be clear about that. So when you have autoplay and other features, the child begins to take control, right? And so now they become the sort of producer of their own experience in some ways. And that's a lot of power for a young kid. And so I tell a story in the book about, my then 5-year-old. I had an hour. I was trying to follow the guidelines. I had some housework to do. Okay, 1 hour. This is his hour of screen time. I gave him my iPad. I download YouTube Red for kids. I got rid of the ads. And an hour later, he had the biggest tantrum I had ever experienced in my life. And I was like, whoa. And I thought, maybe he's sick. Maybe he's hungry. Something's clearly going on. Another hour went by, another day, and same thing happened. And my wife noticed that, that doesn't happen when he's watching long form educational content on a big screen. Certainly doesn't happen when we read to him for an hour, what's going on. And what I realized doing the research in the book is that, this is a documented phenomenon, that kids of a certain age can't handle all the scrolling and all the choice making in the short form, content. It kind of, again, begins to rewire their brain that they aren't focused long enough on any continuous thought, and constantly jumping impulsively to the next bit of stimulus, that it kind of, dysregulates them, and leads to these, again, what I can only describe as the worst temper tantrum I've ever experienced in a child. So you can imagine what that was like.
Yeah, no fun. Go ahead.
But let's go back to the brain for a second, because I think it's really important for your audience to understand, not only that developmentally the brain changes. Okay, we understand that. When we change our behaviors, as you mentioned, we change our brain. There's no question about that. I think we've all changed our behaviors and habits around smartphone technology. You just have to walk down the street to see that. if you are not looking at your phone while you're walking, and even driving. I talk about in the book how all of these changes have resulted in new habits, and new habits rewire the brain. No question about that. But why is that necessarily bad? We have all kinds of habits, right? Well, it's not necessarily bad, and it's not bad for everyone. But in order to understand what's going on in the brain and why all these screens and media are potentially harmful, is we have to understand the prefrontal cortex, right? So the prefrontal cortex is the most highly evolved part of the brain. It sits behind our forehead and our eye socket. And in the book, I use the metaphor of the conductor in the orchestra of our brain, and its job is to kind of pull in the different parts of the orchestra, or the brain parts that we need for any particular function. And there's a difference between harmony and cacophony or noise. And a lot of that has to do with how mature our prefrontal cortex is, but also how healthy it is. And we've all had the experience of being very tired or sick and not being able to concentrate and think straight. Well, that's basically your prefrontal cortex not feeling right, not doing its job. Well, and keep in mind that the prefrontal cortex is also the difference between impulse and insight, attention and focus, or distraction and focus, and reaction and reflection, right? It's really critical and separates us from all other animals on the planet. Okay, now contrast that to an area of the brain people may have some knowledge of, the reward centers and the amygdala, the emotion centers. These areas are in the subcortex, right? And if you take all the complexity of the brain and you simplify it into kind of a balancing act between the prefrontal cortex, the judgment, the brakes on the gas, the thoughtfulness, should we really do that? And the impulsivity, the reward, the excitement, the emotionality of the subcortex. The game is to keep those things in balance, right? And the reason kids are so wonderful is they have zero balance. So they're all about, emotion and enthusiasm, and everything's new and everything's great. But that comes with a lot of risk. So it requires a lot of oversight and a lot of containment because they don't have a mature prefrontal cortex to do judgment. Okay, so as we develop, the prefrontal cortex gets healthier and stronger. It begins to tamp down a bit the reward centers and the emotion centers, right? At any stage of development, if there's too much emotion and reward, you can stress out your prefrontal cortex. Too much multitasking, you stress out the prefrontal cortex. Too many video games, too much shopping, too much anything is going to tip the balance. We know from now, several decades of neuroimaging of addiction, for example, that clearly people who are addicted to substances, whether it's cocaine, opiates, or alcohol, their prefrontal cortex has essentially shut down, and their reward centers are driving the bus, right? That balance is off. Well, we're beginning to see those patterns in non-drug, behavioral-based addictions, whether it's video game overuse, and there's some data out of Asia showing that there are clearly young kids who are so hooked on video games, they look like their brain's addicted, to addiction to online pornography. Certainly gambling leads to the same pattern. And I believe that, you could make the argument that other behaviors, when they get to a place where they're unhealthy, we would see the same pattern in the brain. So everything in the book and everything in life is really about the balance between, supporting your prefrontal cortex, getting it to full maturity, allowing it to do its job, which is to kind of filter and put the brakes on when appropriate, not all the time, of course, but when appropriate, to our reward centers and our emotion centers. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's great. And I love the visual kind of, seeing it really as these two main centers of that emotion and the control, and how it just gets out of balance. So then my question is, when it comes to it, and you do provide a lot of really practical tips at the end of your book on basically how to manage the balance. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that. And obviously it kind of depends on the different age levels as well. But what would that look like? Because obviously we can't really live in a world where we don't use our technologies at all. So how do we manage that balance between the emotion and the control center, basically?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? You know, if you have, and as I have as a psychiatrist, treated people with addiction, whether it's opiate use disorder or alcohol use, one of the things you spend a lot of time talking about is, you have to stop taking the drug, and one of the ways you do that is to avoid environments where there's a lot of it, right? It's you got in some cases you got to get a whole new set of friends. People who are addicted to alcohol have to drive, different routes sometimes so they don't go by their favorite watering holes. You spend a lot of time on that part. There are other aspects of treatment, but really trying to control the environment, because exposure is one of the triggers for a lot of addicts. Well, how do you take away? Can you see it? I'm trying to put the phone there. How do you take away, technology when it's part of all of our lives, right? You can't. So when it comes to treatment, and I think the Digital Wellness Institute does this so well, is it's really about, okay, how do we create a relationship technology that's healthy, right? There's this big debate in the in the alcohol literature, for example, is does everybody have to go cold turkey, or can we take people who had a problem with their use of alcohol and help them get to a healthy balance? Well, it's a sort of the same issue here, right? Can we honestly, take away at this point, a technology that 99% of the people on the planet are using every day? Probably not. So we have to put up guardrails, and we have to set people up. And I would argue you have to sort of try to move towards a prevention model, because it's much easier to prevent bad habits than it is to unwind them once they're produced. So that's part of the reason, in the book, among many things, we talk about how it's going to take a village. It's going to take everybody, whether it's government regulation, parents getting together to work together to make recommendations. I mean, look, we don't allow children to drive a car until they're 16, and even then they have to pass the cognitive test, they have to pass a vision test, and they have a chaperone for a period of time after passing a behavioral test. And even then, they pay a little extra in auto insurance and for another 10 years until their brain fully develops, right? But yet we're going to give children a supercomputer in their pocket with a high-speed connection to the entire internet with a whole bunch of apps with no training. It's a terrible idea. So what does training look like? What does a license for a smartphone look like? How do we come together and decide what's the right age? I was just quoted in the Wall Street Journal last week. Julie Jargon writes the family and technology section, and we've had this ongoing conversation now for several months about different topics. And her latest one was, what is the right age for social media? And I told her the story I just told you, and some other research she had done suggested maybe 16 is the right age. That's going to make a lot of 15, 14, and 13, 12-year-olds very disappointed when they find out they have to wait. But if everybody's waiting, it's a little bit easier. If it becomes a common expectation, it's a little bit easier. If society puts up structures and rules in place, it becomes a lot easier. So I think, on the kind of population level, I think we really need to think about this technology as for what it is: incredibly powerful, incredibly productive, but also incredibly risky. Point number one. I think point number two, as a field, mental health in general, and psychiatry in particular, as a card-carrying member of the American Psychiatric Association, has done a terrible job in the last 10 years, right? Every major mental illness, depression, anxiety, substance use, PTSD, tragically suicide, has gone up, not down, right? So we're doing something wrong as a field. Now, there are some countervailing forces and headwinds, there's no question about that. But we have to do better. And guess what? There aren't enough clinicians in the country to treat everybody's problem, right? So we're going to need to use technology of some sort to actually solve the problem. So, part of what we're talking about here is that, and the same discussion is happening with artificial intelligence right now, right? You can't pick up a newspaper or really go anywhere and not have someone say, what are your thoughts on AI? Well, it's the same thing as the smartphone, right? It's a tool, it's a technology. just like the proverbial knife in the hand of a surgeon is a tool for healing power, the knife in the hand of a murderer is a tool for destruction and death, right? It's about intent, right? So I think, the one thing the pandemic did is create a lot of awareness about these issues, because everybody's screen time went up. We now live in a hybrid world where, I haven't seen the latest statistics, but just the amount of time I spend in front of a screen on Zoom alone, has blown away what happened prior to the pandemic. We have this new vocabulary, Zoom fatigue, right? I've got to manage my energy in a whole different way. I'm in meetings and I'm like watching people's eyes dart around. It's like, you're not paying attention. It's just like a whole new game we're playing. Look, we're doing it now. But we're reaching a whole new audience, and we're having a global conversation. So I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying it's everything in moderation. Point number 2. Point number 3 is, yes, in the book, there are 10 recommendations. I'm happy to walk through a handful of them if that's of interest, but they all are designed, as you say, to do one thing, which is, either to support our prefrontal cortex, to restore balance between the higher executive functions of the brain and the more impulsive, emotional, and reward centers of the brain. Because I think I know that's what it's going to take for us to have some kind of tech life balance in a world that's changing very, very quickly.
Thank you. That's amazing. And yeah, I know. I mean, your recommendations are really spot on. I think before handing over questions to our participants, I wanted to ask at the beginning, you talked about how we are wired for social connection, and this is something that our brain is naturally doing, and
Yeah.
Right, it's just part of obviously us. And this is one of the things I always hear as a professor from students when I ask, what do you like about your tech use and your social media use there? And they always first say, oh, I can connect with my friends, and and this connection part is something that's top of mind for them. So as a neuroscientist, right, because we also trick ourselves a lot of times. So like, oh yeah, it's totally good for me. I'm just eating this little bit of chocolate, and I just do it every day, but I don't tell anybody, and it's totally good for my health. And right, so we trick ourselves. So are we tricking ourselves to think, or specifically also, again, young adults trick themselves to think, oh, this is really good to help me with my social interactions, or not really? Like, from that neuroscience standpoint, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, Sophie, I think there's a difference between having a little bit of dark chocolate every day and eating it 3 times a day as your sole source of calories, right? And so I think it is not surprising to hear young people, particularly, I'm guessing early, mid, late teenagers. I mean, you're teaching college age kids, right? I mean, so
Right.
these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, which is, from a brain development perspective, right smack in the middle of adolescence, to be clear. And they, in the book, I quote Eric Erikson, the famous developmental psychologist, who said, in the teenage years, there are only 2 questions that matter. Who am I? And how do I fit in? And so if you have a platform that allows you to experiment with that question with a lot of different social groups and a lot of different identities and a lot of different ways to connect, of course you're going to be on it all the time. And of course you're going to talk about it as the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? The challenge, of course, is, how do you answer the question, who am I and how do I fit in, when you're getting instant feedback in the form of likes to posts, when you're looking at and making social comparisons with people who are using filters in highly curated lives that don't actually reflect reality. Well, it's one of these recipes for disaster, right? Let's pause there and go back to where we started, if I may. So I spent over a decade monitoring the physiology of audiences in response to media, whether it's media content, advertising, and we did everything from the Super Bowl to a full-length feature movie to shorts on YouTube. And I will tell you, the most emotionally engaging moments of every study we did were the beginning and the end when one of our staff members went in and gave instructions. And the reason it is because physical proximity and actual human connection is 10, 20, 100x more emotionally engaging than any experience you're going to have on any video, full stop. So with that in mind, you tell me what's going to generate the type of physiologic response, the type of emotional connection that for 1,000,000 years we've been wired to create with our children because their brains are so fragile at birth. And tell me that we can replace that with a piece of technology. It's not going to happen. So let me give you a couple statistics. From about 2000, year 2000 to about 2020, a roughly 20-year period, the Nielsen company, of which I was the global neuroscientist for about 4 years, the gold standard for measuring media consumption says that the adult male and female adult people in the United States went from, on average, consuming about 45 hours per week of media. That's a full-time job, to double in a 20-year period, close to 80, some measures 90 hours per week. It's an extraordinary amount of media consumption, right? In that same period, when you survey adults and say, what percentage of people say that they have no one, not a single person who they can connect with, it went from 2% to 12%, so 10 percentage points. The number of people living alone doubled, and the rates of anxiety, depression, substance use went through the roof. Now, correlation is not causation, but I think we're seeing, particularly in young people, huge rates of emotional problems, and it's because the prefrontal cortex, connected to the emotion centers, that connection is the sole cause of every mental illness in the diagnostic and statistical manner. The connectivity between those two areas of the brain are directly causally related to mental illness. So if the prefrontal cortex is fried because of too much media exposure, it's going to have trouble regulating emotion. And I don't care how many friends you have online, you're not going to build the resiliency, you're not going to be able to manage your emotion, and you're ending up in a bad place. And I'm sorry to get on my soapbox here, but it's obviously something I've been spending some time thinking about. And I think I've been a little too soft-spoken on the topic, so I'm going to start yelling.
I appreciate it. Soapbox, yes.
I know this is a good audience to do that with, right?
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes the truth isn't just sweet and pretty all the time, but it's necessary to hear, and it's not just an opinion. This is something, again, we see literally in the brain. Like, I'm trying to tell this to my students always, to really bring the point home that this is not just this little sentiment. It's actually having an imprint, like in your brain, like in your physiology, and these are then the results that come from that. And so yes, I appreciate you putting it out there.
And I appreciate that, but I will tell you, even after the book came out, there was still a part of me that's like, you know what, I don't have the smoking gun yet for the direct connection between media and pathological brain wiring. And then it happened, and the pandemic gave it to us, right? Same Wall Street Journal reporter introduced me to something I had missed that came out in the pandemic. And have you heard of TikTok ticks? Right, so there's a network of movement disorder clinics in North America, Canada, and the U.S. that share data, and the classic Tourette's tic occurs in young males, typically 3 to 5 years, and each tic is unique. It's idiosyncratic to the child. In the middle of the pandemic, they started to see increasing numbers of a new form of tic disorder in young women who were in their teens, and they all had the same tic. And it was from watching TikTok and watching influencers move their mouth in a certain way or make certain gestures that they had internalized and got to the point where they couldn't stop it. I was like, okay, here it is, the smoking gun, right? You've just used TikTok to rewire your brain to the point where some of these kids can't get their hair cut because they can't stop moving their head. My niece had pathological lip smacking. She couldn't finish a sentence without doing this, because she'd watched someone do it online forever. So we should probably take some questions, but that's when I was just like, all right, the research to me was very clear, but to get that direct causal connection was hard to do. And I think the pandemic did it.
Mm-hmm. Wild, yes, okay. I'm stop jabbering because I could also talk on this forever. So let's get into some questions. Our amazing CEO, Amy Blankson from the Digital Wellness Institute is here as well. Amy, do you want us to start off? I know you were monitoring some of the questions. Would you like to call out maybe the first one?
Sure thing. There have been a lot of great questions, and if there's any more, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll see how many we can get to today, but thank you so much, Dr. Marci. This is fascinating. One of the questions that has been consistently asked is about messaging to pediatricians who are on the front lines of this topic. Have you done any work with them, and any recommendations you'd pass along to pediatricians that you think could be helpful here?
Yeah, it's something I've given thought to. I'm open to suggestions. The American Academy of Pediatrics has put out what I think are really wonderful science-based recommendations for parents that very few people have heard about or read. So I think there needs to be an awareness campaign that these guidelines exist. Number one. Number two, pediatricians are primary care doctors. All primary care doctors are overwhelmed. They don't get paid enough to do what they need to do. They don't have enough time to see enough patients. So it's hard for me to recommend that they take the time to screen patients. But I think, and we've talked about this, right? We need screening tools that are short. We essentially need the PHQ-9 for screening for, which is a screening tool for depression that patients fill out prior to their visit. We need screening tools that parents can fill out prior to visits that are simple, easy, well-validated, that can help pediatricians, raise awareness, flag issues. And then we have to give them a toolbox for what to do when issues are flagged. I think among the challenges, we as a field, meaning, child and adult psychiatry, need to do is we need to move past this conversation, with all due respect to the three of us. Like, it's terrible. Yes, it's terrible. It changes the brain. Yes, it changes the brain, right? We need to do something. Yes, we need to do something. Okay, but who's at most risk? How do we identify the people most at risk? When do we intervene? How do we intervene, right? Those are the next questions that I think will be coming along. And I know you guys are thinking about those, but pediatricians on the front line. My own kid's pediatrician, right? I'm constantly giving him a hard time. It's like, you didn't ask about media exposure. It's like,
I think that's well said. And, as the wife of a pediatrician who specializes in adolescents, I hear this a lot. And I think one of the things that is challenging that I hear from him is that it takes a long time for research to go from academia to be approved by the American Academy of Pediatrics, enough that recommendations are put forward. And then a few years down the road, parents finally hear about it. Do you have any recommendations for academia or the AAP, maybe, to help speed up that process, knowing that the world is changing so rapidly?
Yeah, I think we all just need more sense of urgency, right? This is a problem that's not getting better, it's getting worse. And whether that's more government funding, whether it's getting advocacy groups, like what you all are doing. It really has to come from every place. And I've talked about how the pandemic cut both ways. On the one hand, we're all spending more time on all screens, and the data is very clear about that. And mental health outcomes are worse than ever. On the other hand, more people are aware that it's a problem than ever before, because it's clearly just gotten out of hand. So I went from spending time pre-pandemic educating people on the problem to where you all went, which is how do we fix it, right? Okay, good thing I thought about that too.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. Another along that line of getting research into the hands of parents and advocates, there's several questions about how they can access some of your studies and materials, a blog on the experiment you shared around observation of withdrawal symptoms, anything like that. Where would you point folks to?
Yeah, so I would just go to my website for now, rewiredthebook.com. So just rewiredthebook.com, and under the press section, I've got, I need to update it, but with some of the more recent stuff, but just about every interview I've ever done. And it really runs the gamut from book excerpts to blog posts to interviews in various outlets. and the topics vary from, what should parents do in preparing to travel to, what's the best age to introduce social media to, what is the neuroscience of engagement. So, I think that's a good place to start. Obviously, the book has over, I think 500 references in it that, were hand curated and are quite good.
Awesome. Great. That's wonderful. Next question for you is, what do you think? Do people have healthy working habits with computers and digital screens nowadays? Is there a way to build them? And if not, what do you think, or how much time will it take us as human beings to adapt to digital screens without harming our health, especially eye and posture?
No, yes, and a long time. So, so I think that there's a lot of bad habits that have been developed. I think, look, again, whether it's a personal computer, a tablet, or a smartphone, these computers essentially are so incredibly powerful that they can just, it's more than the computational power than put a man on the moon sitting in our pocket, right? It's a pretty powerful statistic. So it will move faster than us. It will be smarter than us pretty soon. And it has the ability to dominate our lives. So we have to make a choice, right? Are we going to react to that and just kind of do whatever, the technology and the big companies want us to do? Or are we going to say, hang on, we have to be a little more intentional about how we use this. Again, I'll go back to the metaphor of a knife, right? You got a big, super sharp knife in the kitchen, right? And you're going to use that to slice a tomato, right? You're going to want to have your eyes open. You're going to want to do a little planning. You want to make sure your hand is not too close to that knife. You're going to want to go slow, and you want to keep your focus on the task, right? We have to take the same approach to our technology, right? We got to focus on it. We have to be thoughtful when we have to think about it. Like, even right now, I forgot to turn my phone over after I pick it up, right? And I've just got 3 notifications and my eyes just went over to it. I'm like, stop it. So I got to turn it down. I'm going to move it behind the computer so I can focus on you, right? I did turn the sound off, right? I put it in silent mode, but I got to do a better job. Look, we all have to do a better job. What I tell people, whether it's work or otherwise, like, look, if I could increase your productivity, make you happier, and give you better relationships, would you want that? And everybody goes, yeah, I would want that. Okay, change your relationship with technology.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. That's it.
Yeah.
I actually want to tap onto that because that sounds something that as an adult you're like, yeah, for sure. There were a couple of questions actually here in the Q&A where people are interested in how do you, however, have this conversation with your teenager, where they're just going to come back to you and be like, no biggie, like, I'm fine, everybody's doing it. Like, how, do you have any tips on that?
Yeah, it's a really hard problem. And this goes back to, these movements, wait till 8th, right? Getting parents to sign on so that you don't have the social pressure. Like, my twins are just finishing 1st grade and we're pretty good at home about what they're exposed to, what they can, but I can't control their kids, their friends and their friends' parents. And the stuff that comes out of their mind, their mouth, just blows my mind. I mean, they're talking like 10, 12-year-olds. And I'm just like, where did you learn that? It's like, oh yeah, they learned it at school from some, there only takes one kid in the class to be exposed to, all kinds of stuff to start sharing it, because everyone gets excited about it because it's the new titillating thing, because you're breaking all the social norms. So the earlier the better, having just honest conversations, not being overly paternalistic, meaning, like, you have all the answers and they're wrong. Like, it's got to be a conversation, and it's got to be, I think, part education. And there are kids, by the way, there was an article on several months ago about these kids kind of banding together and just reading books and getting feature phones and getting off social media, right? So pointing to examples that not everybody's actually doing it. And then also pointing out some of the downsides, right? Whether it's showing images of kids with these TikTok tics, showing images of young women, unfortunately, with eating disorders in these videos, looking at some of the consequences of, online, video games. I mean, I tell the story about Lee Sun-suk, the South Korean kid who played, in a video arcade for 2 days straight and forgot to eat and drink and died of a heart attack. I mean, that's a pretty big consequence. So, I think we have to work together to do that, but the social pressure to be cool and fit in and do what everybody else is doing is very high. So you got to nip that in the bud. The other thing I will say is the most important time to educate your kids is before you give them that first phone, because that's when they're most motivated. Because they want it so badly, right? So setting clear rules, sticking to it, starting with the feature phone. I was talking to this guy the other day, he's very tech savvy, and we were having this conversation. I said, what did you do? So I gave my kid a smartwatch with no phone. So he could, very limited text, he could make emergency calls and basic calls. He had some functionality, he could be cool, but he didn't have a full, smartphone. I was like, that's interesting. So we need more ideas like that. We have to gradually introduce this technology. We can't just go right to a full featured iPhone. It's just silly.
Amazing. Thank you. Amy, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's so many good questions coming in. We'll see how many we can get to in the next 9 minutes here. One of the questions was around the diagnosis of ADHD and exposure to digital media among younger children. Is there research on increased rates of diagnosed dyslexia, or is that more correlation than causation?
Yeah, so dyslexia is very different than ADHD, right? One is an attentional problem. We kind of know that the neuropathology of ADHD is clearly in the prefrontal cortex. And there are medications and things, and behavioral interventions, things you can do for ADHD. Dyslexia is a reading disorder. It's a disorder of how the brain takes in what are called phonemes. And the phonemes are these little bits of combinations of letters that get jumbled in the brain, and that's more has to do with how we process language than attention. Now, some kids have dyslexia, also have ADHD, and that's just another thing. But there's no evidence to my mind that media exposure would increase the risk of dyslexia. It tends to be more inherited and more genetic. But to the extent that you could avoid adding ADHD, which is environmental in many cases, about half of the variance in ADHD is environmental, to a dyslexic child, that would be worth doing. What do I mean by that? Well, remember we were talking about risk factors. Well, having dyslexia is a higher risk for ADHD. So that child probably needs even less exposure, right, to early media than a child who doesn't have dyslexia, because they're going to be at higher risk for ADHD already, right? And that's an example, and I'm just making this up, of someone who may be predisposed to future problems they had to be extra careful with.
Mm-hmm. Great. And another hot button question right now, which is on AI. Do you really feel like AI has shifted the urgency for more systemic change in education and society to increase opportunities to have in real life exposure for adolescents, in particular, what you said about their brain development? So is AI having an impact? Has it been studied yet on adolescent brains, or is that to come?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by AI, right? So I think right now everybody's talking about these large language models like ChatGPT, and the reason there's so much attention to them is because of essentially what happened earlier this year when they got released, that was beyond the expectation of even people in the field, for these machines, this technology, to produce human-like responses. So that's very different from AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is this idea that computers can think on their own. We are not there yet. We're hopefully several years, if not decades, from that. But I think the reason everyone's so excited and focused and worried about this is this: if you zoom out for a second and you look at sort of the history of technology, whether it's fire, or the Gutenberg press, or the wheel, agricultural age, industrial age, these were, a single invention that humanity had time to adapt to and integrate into society. We are now in an era where we're having wheel-like discoveries every few years. Just in our lifetime alone, right? We had, the internet, well, we had the personal computer, the internet, then smartphones, and then early AI, and then cloud computing, and then now, large language models and a movement towards general intelligence, all within the span of a couple decades. That's extraordinary. And our brains really, even healthy brains have trouble getting our heads around that kind of change, all happening at once. So number one. Then number two, a wheel is this round object that helps move objects, right? You can get your head around that pretty easily. But it doesn't look like us and sound like us, right? These large language models sound like us, right? So for the first time, this technology is more like us than any other technology. And that should make the little hairs on the back of our head stand up, as it does mine, and make us start to sort of think a little bit about, how that fits into everything, whether it's adolescents, young people, or adults. I imagine, and I don't have data on this, but if I were to speculate, the crystal ball question is, I think teenagers will find new uses for large language models that adults won't. And I think some of them will be incredibly creative and some of them will be incredibly destructive. And we have to figure out a way to sort of tell the difference between those two.
Absolutely. Well, I think you're so well said on that. And we have one more question I think we could get to that I actually want to kick over to Sophie. Unfortunately, we didn't get to a lot of questions, but the good news is that Sophie can also share with you a little bit about how we'll have more events like this so we can answer more questions and keep the dialogue going. But Sophie, just to close out, one of the questions was, is there a way to measure mental health score of a certain person based on screen use time, content, or maybe other factors? I thought you could speak to that one, the digital flourishing model.
Yeah, this is one of the things, right? Dr. Marci talked obviously about training and providing a roadmap, but he also talked about, which is what we really need to get better at, is actually seeing where do people start off, like where do they stand, so that we can then actually measure improvement. And so I'm just going to share my screen here for one last second. This is the digital flourishing wheel, which some of you may know, but this is kind of our way of approaching a roadmap and a way to measure where people are in their tech use, and how well they might be already doing, or where there might be improvement needed, because that's also another way to look at technology, right? It's not going to go away. We have to understand that the prefrontal cortex is having limitations, and we need to cater to that. But when we even just switch kind of the way of looking at it in terms of, okay, what do I already do well and how can I maybe increase that? So really that positive psychology lens, it's another way of thinking of interventions, if you will, right? These trainings to think of, okay, if I'm already kind of good and actually maybe saying no to too much messaging, then this is something in the communication domain I can actually maybe now take over my entertainment and kind of well-being or fun domain, and maybe I can say no more often to some gaming online, but instead go outside for some gaming, right? So we can leverage some strengths we already have to implement more change into the areas that we struggle with. And so within the Institute, this is kind of the framework we're operating in, and we actually provide a certificate training for leaders, educators, anybody working in the health promotion area, where we provide you with research-based tools and strategies to achieve and to teach the state of digital wellness. So if you're interested, we have a new live cohort starting in September. We also have an on-demand program. So this is something you can totally check out to also become part of a community, because that's what we've learned today as well, right? Doing this work by ourselves can be very isolating, but you're not alone. There are other people that work in this domain and think about the roadmap, think about the training, think about diagnosing and seeing where people stand, so we can really tap in as early as we can to make change happen. I also want to just quickly share the next event that we have here coming up next month with another amazing speaker, Professor and Dr. Gloria Mark. She will be sharing more on the topic of attention span based on her book. So mark that in your calendars, register just like you did for this event. And lastly, of course, I would to very much give a big hand to our first webinar Fireside Chat participant or leader here, Dr. Carl Marci. Thank you so much for coming today, sharing your amazing work with us. And please, everybody, get the book Rewired. It's amazing. It has so many also really hands-on practical tips and tricks for you provided. So you don't just leave there hanging to think, oh, my prefrontal cortex is just overwhelmed. No, you get really practices to tackle that. So please reach out if you have any other questions, and I hope I'll see you all in our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.